and welcome to Voice on Climate Youth podcast, designed by youth to mainstream the awareness about climate change and urging for climate action. Together with me, Lulu, your host for this podcast, this fourth episode will talk about compensating climate change impacts through loss and damage mechanism. This podcast will attempt to reveal the unequal impact of climate change in many parts of the world, divining and unveiling the history of loss and damage mechanism, and the importance also the pathways to implement loss and damage mechanism, which we will end with finding out what is actually the role of young people in encouraging and implementing the loss and damage mechanism. Together with us, our guest speaker, Ashawnté D, a Max Thabiso Edkins Climate Ambassador 2023, an initiative of Global Youth Climate Network by World Bank Group Youth to Youth Community, will share her insights upon this topic. Hi, Ashawnté, how are you?
I am doing great. Thank you for asking. How are you?
Good, doing good. Ashawnté, thank you so much for asking and for having us in this podcast. Now, before we jump onto the discussion, would you like to tell us about your current activities related to climate actions apart from being an MTE ambassador?
Yes, gladly. So, apart from being a member of the MTE cohort for 2023, I'm actually pretty active in the Bahamas as well as in the Caribbean region. So, for 2023 to 2024, I'm actually serving as the female climate youth ambassador for my country. And basically what that entails is coming out of, I'd say, COP26 and the definite, understandable and necessary frustration that you've demonstrated, my country decided that it would be best to actually meet this issue in the middle by providing an opportunity for young people to actually have a say in this particular discussion space. So out of that initiative, came the Youth Climate Ambassador, and I would be serving as the second female for its initial installment. So within that capacity, essentially, we have a mandated platform for engagements, definitely meaningful and impactful international collaborations, as well as the fostering and bolstering of climate education, awareness, and outreach. And specifically in the Bahamas, it's been something that we've definitely needed for quite a while, not just because we're a small island developing state, but within the Caribbean in itself, we are a unique nation because we are an archipelago. The reality is from each island bears a completely different challenge. And honestly and truly, being from the capital, I'm in one of the more uniquely, I'd say, infrastructured settlements. So many projects and so many, I'd say, implementations tend to be housed in the capital, and it puts us in a very dangerous position because if Hurricane Dorian has taught us anything, it just takes one storm to completely rattle our system. So this ambassadorship offers the opportunity to not just share with the youth what it is we need to do, but the definite hope is that that information will disseminate across generations and we will actually be able to make sense of the situation we find ourselves in.
Exactly. Disseminating the truth and also the impacts of climate change in many parts of the world is really important, and hoping that your great work can continue to inspire young people to act for climate especially. Now, thank you so much for introducing yourself. Let's move on to the discussion. Ashawnté, I would like to ask, in your opinion, seeing that the climate change do impact the whole world, are there actual differences in terms of vulnerability between one and another countries?
I would say in a sense, yes. And the reason I say in a sense is because the reality is climate change poses a multi-generational and a multi-sectorial challenge in itself. So globally, every country is going to be affected. But where the difference lies is in that keyword vulnerability. There will be some nations that will feel the brunt of it worse simply because of their geolocation, the geopolitics surrounding their nation, the access they have to funding materials, different resources. There are different factors as well as socioeconomic factors that tend to play a role in this discussion. So I'll use the Bahamas again as an example. We are a developing nation and we find ourselves in the unique, though amongst the Caribbean nations, because our currency is on par with the US dollar, we are deemed uniquely I'd say dependent, though they tend to tell us that we're capable because of our access to different funding. But the reality is, in the grand scheme of things, when talking about climate change, we fall into the category of SIDS. We fall into the category of nations that are dependent upon other nations to keep things in flow. And should one of those developing parties that we partner with, I say partner because we are in a partnership with them. We are dependent on them for certain things. So we find ourselves in that state of vulnerability simply because we rely on another nation. So when bringing it back to the whole climate change discussion space, when you look at nations like the Bahamas or Belize or Grenada, for example, in the Caribbean sense, we find ourselves in a more vulnerable situation because we are more dependent. We are literally in the position where, worst case scenario, if there's a climate disaster, we have to depend on other nations in order to rebuild resilience. We don't have the capacity to do that on our own. So in comparing it to other nations, for example, like the United Kingdom, if you put us on a scale and measure vulnerability, we will always come up short simply because we don't have those infrastructures in place. So though the United Nations is definitely going to be affected by climate change, if you put it on a time scale, we will feel the brunt of it before they do. We will have to build resilience far more than they would have to. And in the absolute worst scenario, if we are taken off the map, it will be us before them. So in that sense, yes, there is a very, very definite difference in terms of what vulnerability means in the climate change space.
Now we see that actually climate change do unequally impacts countries as SIDS or small island developing states can have a more severe impact rather than the other countries as well. Now, my question is, what type of impact does it actually experience right there? Is it a rapid or a slow impact?
I'd say it depends on the level of impact. The reason I say that is because let's use the current situation of coral degradation in the country. So with the increase of sea level rise and decrease of sea level in itself, that pretty much puts our corals in a very unfavorable situation. So compacted by the fact that they're already dealing with stony coral tissue loss disease, the factors are really not in their favor. So when you compound the issue of climate change and all of the adverse effects that comes along with it, our corals are over the years being degraded slowly. Now, in a sense, it is, I'd say slowly but rapidly because of how long it takes corals to build resilience against this, regrow and recuperate. In that case, it's a slow process. But again, let's use a more sudden, or let me not say sudden, but let me use a more tragic example, hurricanes. If a hurricane was to come in our direction, that would be a rapid and in some case detrimental situation. So it depends on the situation. It can be rapid, honestly and truly, in terms of hurricanes or storm surges or flooding, for example. I think it was, today is Tuesday. I think it was just maybe Friday or Saturday. One of the islands in our central portion of our country was hit with a rather frightening flash flood, and it's not something that we've seen, especially during this time of year. It's uncommon. And the thing about that was something that was sudden and occurred rapidly because it was to the point where cars were being flooded out of their yards. And in almost every Bahamian either has a boat, a jet ski, or a kayak. And thankfully, that is the case, that we have that culturally embedded because they broke those out earlier than they had planned, because the flooding, it came down much harder and much faster than they anticipated. So in cases like that, where it's a sudden shift that we're not prepared for in terms of how it impacts or how it may unequally impact, it depends on the current trends or current weather systems that is unique to that country. There are countries like Pakistan, for example, that have to deal with things like flash flooding and mudslides. That is something that can onset suddenly. That is not always something that one can prepare for. It just takes a shift in one atmospheric condition, and that is the result. So it really depends. Unfortunately, I see it as an unequal scale from country to country, because today it could be completely fine and nature speaks and it's a whole nother situation the next day. So I feel in terms of the impacts, they range on a spectrum from rapid to slow, but it really depends on the nature of the tragedy.
Because we are already touching about the term loss and damage. What do you think about loss and damage? What is it actually, and why should we care about this?
So loss and damage is, as you know, it's definitely been a conversation that's been knocking around the international space for a number of years now. But coming from a small island developing nation, coming from a nation that consistently has to wrap our head around the words resilience and what that actually means, loss and damage is essentially the opportunity for countries, for nations to have the assistance, the capacity from an international space of having access to funds that helps them to recuperate from, as the term denotes, various capacities of losses or various capacities of damages that is sustained by climate-related disasters. Now, I feel where things tend to get a bit muddled on the subject is when it comes to who is going to pay who and how is the payments going to be done, because the reality is we are a world that is pretty much regulated by cost agreements and then financial and physical responsibilities. But where loss and damage tends to kind of provide a gap is, I look at it from the aspect of, I'll use the Bahamas again as an example, and I'll use Hurricane Dorian because this storm for us was a monstrosity. It's definitely going down in our history currently. And I say currently because we don't know what the next hurricane season will hold, and we're hoping and holding on to faith that it won't hold another Dorian. But with climate change, you never get that certainty. But Dorian cost us $3.5 billion in debt. That took a significant chunk out of our GDP. And as a nation that's already kind of balancing debt, that was something that was catastrophic. And that's something that we are 3 years later still building from. And I say that like that because I've been to the two islands that were affected since the storm. And there's been progress. There's definitely been progression up to this point. But the reason I always use Dorian as a focal point when speaking about loss and damage is because the amount of, in that one day that hurricane sat on one of our islands, we lost about 70,000 infrastructural houses. So we had a population that was homeless. We still have individuals that we have not recovered from that storm. And we know that we will never recover from that storm because it was beyond us. And we literally we're a small island developing state, yes, but we're also a big ocean state. We have more water than we have land. So whenever water rises the way it does, if you get pulled out in the wrong current, sadly to say, it's unlikely that you will ever be recovered. And that's something that we've had to come to terms with as a nation. And it's something that honestly and truly still causes climate anxiety, because every time it rains very hard or every time hurricane season comes, as of late now, we go into overdrive because we don't know. And the fact that we know we can't control the situation puts an additional stress on it. So when circling and bringing this back to loss and damage is more so a contingency plan for nations that are already struggling, nations that are consistently feeling the brunt of climate change, consistently feeling the adverse effects, and consistently having to rebuild from it, the opportunity to have access to funds that may be derived from nations or partners or parties that are majorly playing into honestly the host of problems that climate change causes. Because for us to, let's say we have a hurricane at the middle portion of hurricane season. I say middle portion because it's very common. Let's say worst case scenario, it's a doozy and it does significant damage. We're still in the middle of hurricane season. We're still in the process, and there's still a likelihood of us getting another storm. So while we are rebuilding and trying to recover from one storm, we still have to think about the fact that there may be another one or two on its way. So we have to kind of balance between repair and preparation. And that is when things get muddled, because you're emotionally and financially and physically caught up in trying to survive one thing that your capacity is being pulled between two threads, and something is going to be left behind. So loss and damage is that middle ground, that bridge that fills the chasm that exists for nations like nations within the Caribbean, nations on the coast, for example, that consistently have to hold their breaths during hurricane or cyclone season because we don't know. And we're continuously having to borrow money from nations that, sad to say, may also be playing a part in the climate change crisis. And I do understand that these nations have to do what is necessary, and they're acting in the best interest of their countries, they're acting in the best interest of their economies, their GDPs, they're doing what they have to do to survive. But at the end of the day, if there isn't a revitalization of how it's being done, because if there's one thing we as a species continue to do, we find better ways to do something. We find more efficient ways to do something. So why can't we find more sustainable ways to do it? Yes, it's an adaptive process, and yes, it takes time. But at the end of the day, time is the one thing that is relative, and time is the one thing that we don't have. So what I usually tell people when it comes to loss and damage, you have one or two situations with nations like us. You can either commit to a fund that's going to, yes, take some money from you gradually over time, or in the case where nations like us run the risk of being wiped off the map entirely, you will have to financially take into account that we may become climate refugees. So either way, financially, we may impact you, but at least in the capacity of a loss and damage fund, you're able to work in tandem with other nations that are able to commit to this pledge to alleviate the costs that we may have on ourselves firstly, because we're accepting money from you that we can't pay back as quickly as we may like, or we can't pay back as quickly as we would like to, simply because while we're rebuilding from Hurricane Marion, Hurricane Bobby is coming. And we barely have the money to deal with what Mary did, and Bobby's just waving down the Gulf Coast. That is a consistent issue that we have. So loss and damage is really, it's a double-edged sword, I like to call it, because it's something that we need as nations that are consistently impacted. And it's something that the larger developing nations can use as a way to kind of take the united pressure that countries like us put on them. Because if you are working in tandem with two other countries and you all are as a unit are putting into this fund, we have resources that we can tap into. We don't have, you've already set aside in your budget, in your fiscal plan, what it is you can give. You don't have to operate with the conscious fact that, hey, they may need more money from us. We've already pledged what we can. That is not going to impact whatever it is we're dealing with socioeconomically or fiscally. So I feel it's a balance. It's something that individuals look at as, hey, I'm giving them money, and what about them giving it back to me? But at the end of the day, with climate change, money tends to get poured into situations that you will not get back. That's the unfortunate truth when it comes to climate change.
So here we see about loss and damage. It is indeed a very complicated process, I think, because we are talking about connecting all the dots. Like several states are indeed dependent to other nations' funds, and also they have to deal with readiness and also recovery at the same time. Therefore, an access to funding is indeed important. And I think that's what the world leaders yesterday at Sharm el-Sheikh are trying to negotiate on in terms of arrangement of loss and damage funds. Now, this is a very interesting conversation right here, because previously, before we arranged the loss and damage fund, we have already committed to a climate finance in which developed countries are going to gather and mobilize $100 billion per year to developing states. However, the issue is the implementation remains a challenge. Now, what particular lesson that we can take in order for this loss and damage mechanism wouldn't end up the same like what happens in climate finance arrangements?
I feel like one of the major things that would help making it a difference is world leaders having open and honest conversations, because I can understand from a country standpoint, when you're entering a conversation and you're talking about money, and you're talking about money you're putting into a fund, you're talking about money that you're taking from your country's fiscal budget, your physical wallet, and you're putting it somewhere else for other countries. And I can take myself out of the position of being from a CID and look at it from the perspective of being from another nation. And the reason I say that is because when I think about the thought process of several individuals being in one room and heads potentially bucking, It's because of that lack of transparency. And while your duty and your betterment is to your country at the end of the day, once you sign on to an agreement like this, you have to understand that it comes from, it's not a me versus you conversation. It's an us. And I think that's where a lot of our global conversations tend to get a little muddled, because instead of everyone looking at it as a best interest for us all, we're looking at it as a best interest for me. So if I'm coming in there with a perception that's already kind of like me against the world, literally, I'm not going to be as receptive, and I'm not going to be willing to be as flexible as I could be, because where it is, I'm thinking that they're just out to get everything that I'm able to put forth plus more. It's not just me donating, it's me and a host of other countries. And the reality is, if the countries were putting this money into the fund, had it, the loss and damage fund would not exist. Mm-hmm. That is the sad reality of the situation. And I think the lack of transparency amongst various leader heads, as well as that, just the geopolitics involved as well. I think that is definitely another factor, because it takes me back to preschool setting. I don't want to play with you, but I don't mind playing with you. And I don't want to play with you because I don't mind playing with you. The reality is, if we don't come to a consensus that climate change is an issue that it's going to affect us all, it's just a matter of when. And we have a saying in the Bahamas: today me, tomorrow you. So it doesn't matter how adverse you want to look at funds like this, because definitely on an international spectrum, once money comes into the conversation, things tend to shut down very quickly. Everything is open and everything is receptive, but the minute someone mentions currency, then conversations tend to change, commitments tend to get a little shaky, pledges and conversations tend to get shut down a little prematurely. We can't continuously do that. And that's the one thing that I like actually about our demographic. We're coming to terms with the fact that though they like to tell us we can't reinvent the wheel, at this point, the wheel that they're riding is broken. It's barely taking the car where it needs to go. And if we do not, at this point, rectify the issues that are currently in this multi-generational conversation, we're going to not just inherit the issue, but repeat it. So another thing that I feel world leaders really should take into consideration is having young people from their nations trained and exposed to these areas of conversation. Because the reality is, what they put forth in this fund, we would like it to be concrete. We would like it to be fair. We would like it to be a commitment that will continue as long as we need it to. If we don't establish it properly, it's going to fall through, similar to the last fund, similar to whatever contingencies they had in place before. It's a self-sabotaging thing at this point. If we don't, you won't get it right the first time. You may not get it right the second time too, unfortunately. But if we give it an honest try, if we give it a transparent try, and if we give it a collaborative approach, and we include not just the older among us, but those within our generation that have that interest and recognize that, hey, I have the energy that you don't have, but you have the capacity that I'm trying to gain. If we work together, the work that you guys do, seeing that you guys are actually sitting down and having this conversation, the conversations and contingencies you put in place will not fall through when it gets to us. We can actually either continue with what you're doing, or if the situations are different when we inherit it, we can tweak it in a way that best suits us so we can continue to survive. All that is needed at this point is transparency. Unfortunately, money is always an uncomfortable situation to talk about. And in an international realm, I know that's 110 times worse. But at the end of the day, if we don't talk about it, if we don't come to an agreement, if we don't come to an understanding, the fund will fail, for one. We will have countries that will not get the access to funding that is necessary, for two. Those citizens run the risk of becoming a financial strain on other nations because they will no longer have a place to reside. We don't know what geopolitical issues will arise from that. And we'll find ourselves in more uncomfortable and unpleasant conversations and situations that could have been avoided had we just aimed to play properly together the first time. So I feel at this point, yes, it's uncomfortable, and yes, it's an unfortunate situation to find ourselves in, that we have to actually put contingencies like this in place. But at the end of the day, that's where we find ourselves. It makes no sense to whine about it at this point. We're here. The best we can do is make the most of it at this point so we can actually survive to fight another day.
Let's talk about the regional and local aspects. In your experience, indeed, you may face challenges in terms of implementing the loss and damage projects. What particular challenges you frequently experience, and in your opinion, what young people can do to overcome this?
I feel in a way that kind of goes back to that whole meaningful conversations amongst leaders and the youth demographic. I feel another issue with the loss and damage fund is not just a lack of transparency among global leaders, but a lack of transparency amongst country leaders and those within their country. Because here it is now, this is a fund, and the fund has certain implications, certain commitments, and you're asking for this money to be able to build resilience, for one, to foster preparedness, and to continue to ensure that your countrymen have the capacity, have the financial capacity, that is, to build back should things not work out the way we want. Now, I'm going to be 100% honest with you. In developing countries, I feel as though that is a means of concern, because sometimes the money that is pledged does not necessarily go where it's intended to go. And I think that's another reason why countries are kind of like, we don't mind donating. But if I give you the money to build this, that, and the third, and you don't use the money to build this, that, and the third, that's going to cause problems. That's gonna bring forth conversations that could have been avoided. So I feel as though that transparency starts at the ground level. Individuals within their countries recognizing that, hey, doing proper data collection for, let's say, in settlements where it may have been flattened by a mudslide, and you're reaching out for money to help build resilience within that settlement. You need to have honest and transparent conversations with those that have been affected, do proper surveying, proper census to account for what is necessary. So when you go and ask Jill, Mary, and Joe for money, that money is actually being taken and utilized for what it's needed for. And I feel as though that's where our demographic tends to buck heads with our leaders, because we've noticed that, okay, you say you're going to do this, that, and the third, hashtag youth washing, and it continues to be an issue because you're telling me, hey, we're going to do this, we're going to ask for this, and we're going to use it to empower and rebuild this. But then when the time comes, temporary amnesia tends to come in place, because I see you doing everything except what you said. And that becomes really frustrating. And if countries notice that on a national level, I don't see that going over very well in the international conversation, because that's where accountability comes into place. And that's another thing that a lot of individuals don't like to take. Nope. People don't always like to be responsible. It's a lovely word to use, and people like to factor it into their soft traits and their resumes. But when it comes down to actually being responsible in that moment, especially when it comes to money, well, that is where tables tend to get a little shifty. So I feel in terms of what we can do to encourage the mechanism to be enforced, as a demographic, our sole responsibility as young people in this fight is to hold our leaders accountable. At the end of the day, I like to say that we are a bit spirited. They may use the word rambunctious. They may use, in the Caribbean, they like to use the word bullheaded. But at the end of the day, if this does not go the way we need it to go, we're going to have to suffer through undoing mismanagement, undoing contingencies that were lackadaisical. We're going to have to do Operation Recovery during climate change crisis. So not only are we struggling to survive against nature that is literally trying to take us off the planet, we have to fight against laws and policies that were not established properly. So this country was fighting with this one. This country was fighting with this one. Now they're gone and they're departed, and us, the descendants, are looking at the issues that were caused, and we're just like, this didn't have to happen. This could have been avoided. This was going to be a simple conversation. So now we have to go through the whole united process of undoing this. And there may be a country that we're talking to who has a cyclone heading towards their nation the next day. So I feel as though at that point it's working harder and backwards. So what we can do as a nation is definitely challenge our leaders to be accountable. We're not being, and that's another thing where elders like to confuse being disrespectful with asking for accountability. I'm not being disrespectful if I simply ask you to do what it is you said you're going to do. You've already told us that, hey, this is going to be an issue that, unfortunately, we were the first generation born into this actively happening. And the sad reality is, we're not going to be the last. We have generations coming up behind us. So we're in the unique and unfortunately torch-bearing position, whereas we stand as the gap between those that are trying to fix the problem and those that are going to have to survive if we don't get it right. So if we do not encourage our leaders to actually be accountable, and yes, they may not like it the way we say it, but somebody has to say it. If we don't encourage them to deliver on what it is they say they're going to do, if we don't encourage them to speak on our behalf, if we don't encourage them to liaison on our behalf, then at the end of the day, who are you attesting for? Because you've already said that this is an issue that we are going to inherit. You've told us that we're not educated on the matter, but when we ask for it, there's some form of resistance. The youth washing must end if the loss and damage is going to be enforced efficiently. Because at the end of the day, if we're not privy to the information, if the information is construed, it's not going to be established properly, and we will have part 2 of the last fund. The only difference is we have less time to correct it.
Exactly. Challenge and encourage those who are accountable to act is a sentence that is very impactful right there. We have come on to the end of this conversation, sadly, but I just want to ask you, what message would you like to convey for every young people listening concerning our conversation, especially about loss and damage itself?
I think the last thing I definitely would like to say is, as a global community, we have to move from this consistent state of acknowledgement that we find ourselves in when talking about climate change. This year is going to be the 28th session of the Conference of the Party, and we are still regurgitating some information. We're still tiptoeing and dancing around some obvious problems. We have been in such a consistent state of talking about climate change and not acting against it for so long that I think it's become something that's been slowly ingrained. And while it's a conversation that we definitely have to talk about, it's again a double-edged sword. You have to acknowledge it, but you have to also act. And if we consistently stay in a position of acknowledgement, by the time we decide to act, there won't be much time to act with. We won't have, the situation will not be favorable, and we will not survive as a species. We will not make it. At this point, when talking about compensation through loss and damage, we have to take into account that, yes, money is an uncomfortable situation. It's an uncomfortable topic. But fiscal and financial responsibility when it comes to climate change goes hand in hand. The reality is, not every country is privileged to have immediate access to funds. That's the reality of it, and that's something that we've known since the industrial age. Some countries just cannot do it on their own. Unfortunately, in 2023, it's harder. There are surplus more people. At this point, we're hitting record numbers of human beings. And as the populace grows, we have to adjust. And the reality is, we're not adjusting as fast as we're replicating. We don't have those systems in place. So now we are in Operation Recovery. We are in Operation Damage Control, and we have to be real with ourselves about it. As much as we would like to dance around the topic as young people, we are in that unique position where we have to act, and we have to act now. Within our country, we're actually having our first Bahamas Youth Climate Conference next month, and essentially the conference is directly addressing that chasm that exists, because so many individuals in the Bahamas, young people especially, they can see climate change and what it's causing, but they don't know what climate change is and how damaging it can be. We talk about Hurricane Dorian, but individuals don't understand that, hey, Hurricane Dorian was not a monopoly type situation. He's not going to be the last of his lineage if climate change continues to act the way it is. And the reality is, it's unpredictable. We are literally in a hurricane belt. If we don't come to terms with the fact that, hey, we're vulnerable, and people like to dance around the word like it's an embarrassing thing. The reality is, we are in a delicate situation. Climate change, unfortunately, is going to make everywhere delicate over a matter of time. It's just, unfortunately, when it comes to the grand scheme of things, nations like mine are we're at the mercies of what is happening. And if we don't come to a consensus of understanding that, hey, if there is not a fund in place, if there are not connections in place, if there's not a conversation had with actionable and meaningful collaborations and steps taken, countries like mine, where we have unfortunately pooled all of our resources onto one main island, if one hurricane decides to pass our way and turn slightly, because the island is protected, mind you, we have other islands around us, so we have a little bit of a defense, but it just takes one storm to see a palm tree and just say, oh, that looks nice, and turn and hit us, and the Bahamas would not, without a fund like this in place, we will not survive. The sun, sand, and sea that everyone likes to travel for, it just takes one hurricane to completely eradicate our GDP, to completely eradicate our socioeconomic portfolio, to completely eradicate our populace. Our country is small. We are surrounded by water. Hurricanes love warm water, and that's all we have. Loss and damage is really and truly one of the main contingencies that nations like mine need, because otherwise we're going to be in a situation of consistent borrowing. And again, if we are trying to pay back a loan for one hurricane and there's another one or two that's coming, there's nothing we can really do other than brace, pray, and hope that it's not as bad as the first time. With hurricanes, you roll the dice every time. So it's a really frightening situation to be in. And if there's one thing that young people need to take away from conversations like these, if we don't act, if we don't hold them to the fire to act, we are going to simply sink, burn, drown. It just depends on where you are. But you will be impacted. It's just a matter of when.
That is an important message right there. I really hope that the listeners can really take into account that this climate crisis is real and we really need to do something. And I hope that that particular truth telling right there can raise the listeners' awareness to act for climate. Thank you so much, Ashawnté, for sharing your insights on Voice on Climate Youth podcast episode 4, designed by youth to mainstream awareness on climate change and urging for climate action. Thank you for listening, and see you on future episodes.